Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. I've got a completely new guest on the show this time, but to talk about a topic likely familiar to listeners, the impact of different voting systems on how countries are governed. Welcome to the show, Dylan.
Hi, good to be here.
Now, some listeners may be familiar with your election data graphics, as you often share online fascinating visualizations of what the polls are telling us. But earlier this year, you also wrote a report for Make Votes Matter about the impact of different voting systems on political stability. So, I thought it'd be interesting to chat about that report because I think when people
Mhm.
debate electoral reform in the UK, it's been common to hear comments such as, well, look at Italy with PR, how many governments they've had since 1945, and first past the post at least gives you stability. Of course, recent events in the UK have knocked that argument a bit, but I think it still is quite a widely used anti-PR argument. And it's great, therefore, that your research has dug into what truth or not there is in that. So, what did you look at for your research?
Well, as you say, it's sort of very much a received wisdom, and I think that's something that always attracts me to certain parts of the electoral reform debate. Are these things that are not just sort of the core arguments on one side, but also sort of accepted tacitly by the other. And the fact that so many electoral reformists are willing to accept the idea of a less political
Mm,
stability as a necessary trade-off for proportional representation sort of interests me because I was never really entirely sure whether that was actually a trade-off in of itself in the first place. So what I did was I analyzed, and created 10 measures of parliamentary, governmental, and ministerial stability and looked at them across the past 50 years in 17 established Western parliamentary democracies. And these ranged from how frequently a parliamentary term is completed because of, that early elections are often used as sort of a gotcha whenever there's one in a proportional democracy is sort of,
mm,
well, look, another coalition's collapsed sort of thing.
mm,
And then things like how long cabinet ministers remain in one post, how long prime ministers serve, how long does one party hold the
mm,
position of prime minister. So it's a very much, we try to get as much of a range of different aspects of
mm.
stability as possible to see if there were any, well, if there was a correlation indeed, and if there was, whether it was in any particular type of voting system's favor.
And I guess it's fair to say that the measures you've used for stability, firstly, are impressively a broad number of different measures, but they're
Mhm.
all fairly sort of functional and quantifiable. And I guess the stability point that, at least in Britain, we sometimes look enviously at the rest of Europe about in terms of long-term policy stability. Think
Mhm.
HS2, for example, or child trust funds or pensions reform, the sorts of policies where, in a way, you need to make a decision and then have government stick with it over several decades for it to work. That is, I guess, just impossible to put together a sensible data set to measure on, is it?
Yes, I feel like that has to be more qualitative in
Yeah.
terms of how you assess it. Whereas I wanted to go for, what can strictly be objectively measured. Because you always have, when you come to policy, there'll be different interpretations, different political, realities in
Yeah.
terms of why those policies have stayed. So we really just focused on the, as you say, the mechanical political
Yeah.
aspect rather than necessarily the policy.
Yeah.
Although, as you say, I would be expect if you did find some way of looking at the policy that you would see a distinction between different countries.
Yeah. And certainly one of the measures, for example, about ministerial stability, again, you
Mhm.
think about the obvious example in the UK of how many different housing ministers we've had and how very rapidly that post turns over. It's fairly safe to assume that there's likely to be a definite relationship between, say, ministerial instability and policy instability, if only because every minister wants to come in and say they're doing something new. Okay, so I think you looked at, was it 17 countries in total? I don't know if there was some magic relevance to the number 17 that tipped it past a statistical significance level, or whether it's just, that was what the data was available for. But yeah, how did you sort of pick those countries and which were they?
Well, yeah, 17 is such an odd number, but it was really basically finding countries that are of a similar sort of level of democratic development, have similar bases for their party systems, have similar bases for their politics, because otherwise then you're beginning to add loads more variables that can affect things in ways that, you know, when you're trying to assess a simple binary in terms of voting systems, you want to try and have the countries as similar as possible. Um,
And so
and so,
Russia, for example,
yeah,
how stable and long-lasting Vladimir Putin's rule isn't really to do with the voting system, is it? That would just make
no.
for a false comparison. But did you distinguish between sort of places with fixed-term governments and those without? Because I think refreshing my mind, looking through the report just before we started recording, I didn't see that particularly drawn out. And I guess that is one possible sort of
Um,
external factor outside of the voting system that might influence stability.
no. Well, we didn't include America because obviously that's a very
Yeah.
distinct system and it's a presidential system rather than a
Mm.
parliamentary or
Yeah.
semi-parliamentary system. There are some countries that have elements of
Mm.
fixedness in them, such as Norway and Sweden to various extents have, it's basically either very difficult or impossible to call early elections. But I don't think there's any countries in the samples that are wholly fixed in
Mm.
terms of their government. I think they can all have situations where the government can collapse.
Yeah.
And again, I think the Norway and Sweden angle is comparison is very important because they are probably the two most institutionally similar countries in the study in terms of the way that parliament is structured, in terms of the voting system, things like that. But they are also two countries that we found had very different results across pretty much all the measures, other than parliamentary term completion, where they both have 100%.
And what drove I mean, diving straight into one of the details then, well, let's come back to the big picture. But as you've mentioned, the difference between Norway and Sweden, what drove the difference between those two countries? Because I guess that gives us a clue about how much these structural issues are the determining factor as opposed to country or event specific issues.
Well, I think, as we probably come on to, what we really found is that actually in terms of political stability, there's no real consistent institutional link you can draw. You cannot consistently say, well, this type of parliament will create more
Mm.
political stability or less. And what we really found is ultimately it's all down to culture and the political choices that the politicians within those systems make. So, there are certain things that have made Sweden slightly more stable, which is a slightly higher level of dominance for the Social Democratic Party
Mm.
compared to the Norwegian Labour Party, which means that they are much more able to go on and on and on in power rather than, having slightly shakier cabinets that they have in Norway. Although, again, another such very interesting thing about Norway and Sweden is, of course, they are both countries where minority governments are the norm, which is, of course, in the British sort of common
Mm.
sense in terms of politics, is that these are two, that's something that is automatically, political and stable. And yet Sweden
Mm.
are undoubtedly one of the most politically stable of the Western democracies, despite having minority government as norm.
Yeah. And that idea that a minority government equals instability is also not just a sort of quite a British thing, but also a very Westminster centric thing in
Mhm.
that, we've had long-term stability in Scottish Parliament and Welsh Senedd at various times with minority governments, but also just at the council level, the local councils around
Mhm.
Britain, hung councils with no one-party majority are very common. And although definitely you do get sometimes a political deal breaking down, it's actually pretty rare for the original power sharing arrangement that's set up after a set of council elections to then break down mid-term, or mid-election, election cycle. And so it is a particular Westminster parliamentary concept that we have, I guess, partly due to the fact that the the two most prominent periods of regular hung parliaments and small majorities in Britain is one is in the 1920s, the other is in the 1970s, and both were completely wild political roller coasters of a time. And I guess it's just there's been an association of hung parliaments with instability that is in a way perhaps slightly misleading, because as your research suggests, it's that's not the pattern across other countries. But having skirted around a little bit what your big picture conclusions are, then what was the overall picture that you found from this international study?
Well, basically, we found that actually, you know, not just is there, no causal link, there's not even a correlation really in the first place between a country using a proportional or a non-proportional
Mm.
voting system and being more politically stable or less politically stable. And where there is perhaps a tiny little bit of a correlation is actually in proportional representation's favor, in that on, what was it, 7 of our 10 measures the PR users on average outperformed the non-PR users. And that is including Italy as a proportional country, even though Italy has for the last 30 years used a series of what are called semi-proportional
Mm.
systems that are actually, you know, in some respects closer to non-proportional systems.
Yeah. So
Um,
is the Italian political system more stable than popular British perception would have then, do you think, or is that maybe pushing it a little bit too far?
No, Italy was consistently one of the weaker performers
Right.
across pretty much every single measure. You know, it does very much deserve its reputation in certain respects. Although, of course, as I say, well, I didn't say it. It's a quote from Mueller and Strom's book on coalitions, is that Italy for a long time, had a very stable instability because until the 1990s, the Christian Democrats were always in
Mm.
power, even if the exact makeup of the cabinet was changing every, year or so, they were just a constant at the top.
Yeah. Yeah. Italian politics, in a weird way, reminds me, in that sense, pre the big scandal that broke the Italian political system in the, what was it, late 90s, wasn't it? In a way, Italian politics prior to that, in a way, slightly reminds me of my own experience in the Lib Dems, in that there's no particular role I've had in the party for a especially long time. But because I've consistently been in a series of different national roles, I think to most people it feels like, oh well, Mark is one of those people who's always around, always running things, even though on technical measures of, as it were, turnover of committee membership and so on, I'm pushing the average time served, etc., pulling that down and so on. And I think that's very much the Italian experience, isn't it? You just get people like Andreotti who just kept on being a powerful figure in numerous different guises, even if the sort of instability measures that you're looking at, were sort of rating quite high. But I guess the other thing that Italy and New Zealand, which you also looked at, have in common as well, is they've had major electoral system changes, and so you've had the chance to look at, well, okay, taking Italian political culture in a sense as given, did changing the electoral system then change stability level? So what did you find in those two countries? Did changing the electoral system bring about a change in that sort of stability?
Well, in New Zealand, which is obviously the only Western country that's undergone a wholesale electoral reform in the last 50 years, where they went from a first past the post system to a mixed member proportional system, so a fully proportional voting system. And what we found is that actually it wasn't just that there was no real change pre and post proportional representation, but I actually found it slightly scary how little change there was,
Mm,
how similar some of the measures were. Like parliamentary term completion before and after was about 0.1%
mm,
difference before, 996 and after. And so what you have in New Zealand is a situation where basically despite this wholesale change in the electoral system, despite more parties represented in parliament, despite them actually at the same time as changing PR, undertaking a load of liberalizing parliamentary reforms to make it more like a European
mm.
parliament, despite all these things that in British conventional wisdom would make New Zealand's politics less stable, actually, there's been virtually no change at all in terms of political stability before and after the introduction of proportional representation.
And that's, I guess, a bit double-edged in a way for electoral reformers, because what that suggests is that arguments against electoral reform, because of fears of instability, etc., are not backed up by evidence. On the other hand, it also suggests that some of the arguments in favour of electoral reform about changing the political culture of a country, forcing cross-party working to get more long-term stability, etc., it suggests that some of those pro arguments may be a bit overstated as well, although at least there are obviously other very good reasons to be in favour of PR.
Well, I think there is an element of overstating things a little, perhaps, but New Zealand has, you know, arguably just very well adapted itself from what was single party majority government as standard to various forms of multi-party government as standard. And you do have a greater say for opposition parties in parliament than you did before proportional representation, although those reforms happened in conjunct with the adoption of proportional representation rather than necessarily because of adopting proportional representation. So I think that's always something to bear in mind when people expect PR would necessarily lead to a more European style parliament in Britain. You've got to think some of the reforms have to be done alongside it rather than necessarily expecting things to change automatically. Because as we saw during the Conservative Lib Dem coalition, it is actually perfectly possible to Westminster function as quite a Westminstery government with coalition.
Mm.
So, there is obviously, the need to remember that sometimes proportional representation is just one of a part of the things that make European parliaments different to Westminster, rather than necessarily the sole reason.
And which maybe brings us back to Italy, because that's the other country that's had the change of electoral systems. And is it a similar picture then in Italy to New Zealand?
I think it's a little bit different because Italy hasn't really ever had, well, they had a true list proportional system until 1924. And then since they've gone through a succession of semi-proportional systems, the various weird technicalities, sort of trying to engineer, majorities alongside maintaining an element of proportionality. So Italy's a little different and it's gone from a proportional system to a semi-proportional setup. And we do find that on some stability measures, there has been an improvement in Italy since 1994. I would be very cautious about saying that it's the voting system that is the cause there, because at the same time as you've had this electoral reform, you also had, as you mentioned earlier, the complete collapse of the old political elite and the old party system. And so what you had is you've had a transfer from a very centrist dominated party system, which was where the Christian Democrats were always in power, to a two-block system where you have a set of left-wing parties and a set of right-wing parties that sort of alternate in government rather than various coalitions of centrist parties.
Yeah.
And so that does add a little bit of jeopardy in terms of torpedoing a coalition, because now it's not, well, we'll be back in 6 months. It's, well, actually, our opponents might get in if we, force the government out. And so I would say that it's not necessarily the electoral reform that has changed things in Italy, but rather it is change in the party system that has sort of changed the dynamic, although Italy still remains a weak performer on most issues. And of course, you have now got, as I said earlier, the, what might be called the stable instability of the old Italy has been replaced arguably with just unstable instability.
Yeah. Although I guess also there's a question there about to what extent some of the measures that you're looking at maybe slightly exaggerate the degree of instability in modern Italian politics, in that certainly on the sort of left and the centre left, the electoral coalition, party names, who the candidate for prime minister is, seems to me to have had a lot of instability in the last sort of decade or two. But the fundamental thing is it is, as you say, basically a contest between two blocks. And although the component parts of those blocks have a lot of instability, in one sense, there is just a basic, consistent pattern, which is in one respect more stable than, say, in Britain, where we've had, the rise and then sometimes the decline of a variety of political parties in the last sort of 10 or 20 years. In Italy, yes, the components of the blocks change, but it is a consistent pattern of a contest between two blocks.
Yeah, and I do think, where we see these two block systems across Europe, there is that slightly different way that you can look at things. So in Norway, for instance, you had in Scandinavian countries, they also have a very strong two block tradition. In Norway, for 8 years, they had the Erna Solberg coalitions. And on paper, on the way our measures work on paper, Erna Solberg was in prime minister for 8 years with 4 different types of cabinet because the composition of the parties within the government changed. But actually, it was, basically a stable government with parties switching from being in cabinet and supporting the government from outside. So arguably in the Norwegian context, it wasn't so much, 4 successive governments averaging 2 years, but really one 8-year government. And I think that is something to bear in mind with that we are, to some extent, not just does different political cultures affect stability, but it also affects how people would view stability. So whereas we would see every single change in a cabinet party as an unstable event in Britain, in other countries that might not be seen necessarily as a stabilizing event to the government in the same way that we would think of it.
Yeah. And maybe we should talk a little bit about France and Germany, because they're often the comparators used in Britain. And particularly, I think there is a general assumption that if something's done in Germany, that's often seen as, well, that's an admirable thing to sort of aspire to, that, we tend to view Germany as quite a well governed country. And Germany's had a pretty stable political and party system. There's been the rise of some newer parties, particularly since German reunification. But even that has been more the rise of additional parties rather than, a party imploding, splintering, disappearing, etc. Although the FDP do their best to flirt with disappearance, bad election results every now and again. So what was the picture you found in Germany on how that German electoral system plays out in terms of stability?
Well, yeah, Germany does, as much as Italy gets its reputation at one end for
Mm.
being very unstable, Germany is undoubtedly a very stable polity in terms of the measures we looked at. In fact, I think it was the third strongest performer overall behind just Luxembourg and
Yeah.
Switzerland. And, obviously some of that is down to the fact you have 16-year chancellors, Helmut Kohl and Angela Merkel during our time frame. But you do see consistently that Germany does have a very sort of different approach to coalitions that other countries have, in that there is much stronger sort of impulse to see out the coalition, even if it's sort of, on the rocks a little. Although I guess whether the Scholz cabinet makes it to full term, is has been a little bit different. But generally, at both the federal and state level, that is the general impulse in Germany. Whereas in somewhere like Italy, particularly traditionally, there was very much
Mm.
an impulse of, if this coalition is no longer fully benefiting us, we're getting out. And so that is slightly responsible for that. Although again, I think in Germany there are possibly arguments that certain of elements of the federal constitution, such as having the states represented in the upper house, the Bundesrat, those are sort of stabilizing elements on government, because that's always going to be a presence, and you're always going to have to deal with that very unusual setup
Mm.
that they have. But I do think, Germany is very much deserving in terms of sort of objective political stability. It does meet most of the criteria consistently.
And I guess that also highlights a point that we sort of slightly glided around so far around, but about quite what we mean by proportional representation, because of course that's a
Mhm.
phrase, or electoral reform is, phrases that cover a huge variety of electoral systems. And leaving aside the enjoyable troll fest we can have about whether the alternative vote counts as PR or not, but even within, what are clearly PR systems of the sorts that have in, say, New Zealand or Italy or Germany or Norway or Sweden, just think of the countries we've just been particularly talking about, there's actually quite a lot of variation of electoral systems within that over umbrella,
Mhm.
just within those countries. So what did you find about the extent to which the type of PR system that is in place influences the degree to which governments come out as, or countries, sorry, come out as stable or not on your measures?
Well, I think this is possibly a little bit of a small n problem here,
Mm.
in that there's just not enough countries to establish a link, although you do see a lot of variation between them. Obviously, in terms of specific ones,
Mm.
Germany is a very high performer, and New Zealand, the other user of a mixed member proportional system, is slightly above average. So maybe there you could draw an argument that mixed member systems tend towards that end. But again, I would say that's only two case studies. And so if you look at something like list proportional representation,
Mm.
that varies hugely between, Netherlands, which tends to have quite long-serving prime ministers, and then somewhere like, Belgium, where
Mm.
there's a higher turnover in who's in charge. And I think variation within categories was really a big theme of the report that we
Yeah.
found. That we found for a lot of the countries in the proportional category and the non-proportional category, there were ones at both ends. And also there was variation within each country, where you've had periods of stability and relative instability, although there are a few like Luxembourg, which has
Yeah.
never really had any instability. But generally, like Britain has undoubtedly had periods like the 1980s where you had a high level of political stability, and then, several periods like the 70s, the mid 90s, the last 10 years, where you've had this very high level of political instability. So I think it's always about not necessarily attributing to individual voting systems, because there is so much variation within the categories, and also that problem of not necessarily having enough examples of each. Like if we were to take STV, which has obviously long been a favorite in the UK. Well, our only example in our study was Ireland, which tended to perform a little bit
Mm,
below average.
mm,
But then if you look at Malta, who are the only other sole user of it, who weren't, though we did include them in an addendum, which looked at other democracies, but Malta itself is much more of a high performer on political stability. So it's again, there's
And the
this,
user of STV, Lib Dem
yeah,
listeners will have been crossing Malta off their bingo card because it's always a favourite to pop up in Lib Dem debates and discussions about electoral reform. And I guess your point about how stability and electoral systems, or indeed party systems as well, don't, are not that closely correlated, I guess is illustrated by, our own experience in Britain, that I think most people would describe in at least a general way, the 2019 to 2024 Parliament as a unstable one in many respects, in that, we went through three prime ministers, but the start of that was, an election result that had one party with a very large majority, but also a very clear and second party, and those two top parties were the traditional two top parties. It was in that sense a very sort of mainstream, stable looking political outcome, but it then begat a very, unstable parliament. And likewise, actually, events around the 2017 general election. The 2017 general election, in some ways saw a bit of a return to two-party sort of politics in Britain, but then because of policy issues around Brexit, was followed by absolutely a period of huge political instability, all of which suggests that if we're trying to ask the question about what causes sort of government instability, what causes volatility in the political system, the electoral system is really not the place to be looking, that we should be looking elsewhere.
yes. Well, I think that's definitely it. As you say, the last parliament should by any means have been politically stable within not just British conventional wisdom, but also just general political science wisdom. A single party parliamentary majority of that magnitude should allow for stable government no matter what. But what it really shows is that it's not these necessarily the election outcomes themselves, which are obviously influenced by the voting system, is that are responsible for political stability. It's what happens afterwards. It's the political choices and to some extent the culture they take place in that determines whether a government is stable or unstable. So what we've seen in the UK in recent years is just this complete breakdown in sort of party discipline, particularly in the Conservatives and Labour Party. And that is really the strongest correlate in a way with political instability is inter-party discipline, and when you have coalition governments, intra-party discipline as well. And where you have countries where parties are very disciplined in terms of being very unified in public, and coalitions themselves are very disciplined in terms of not airing their dirty laundry in public or settling things in a more formal manner. Where that is true, you generally have more stable governments regardless of the voting system. And where things like that break down, that's when you get instability. So that was always that's always been a big problem in Italy, is you have very ill-disciplined parties, and the coalitions never really, you know, got used to, doing things behind closed doors in a very formalized manner. You got a lot of, you know, public rows about individual policies and parties staking their claims on things that wasn't necessarily, beneficial to the survivor of the coalition. And so what we've seen in Britain is you have, even though you have a single party government, if you don't have sufficient party discipline, what you effectively have is a badly managed coalition just in one party. And that's what we had during the last parliament, which just led to all these hugely unstable things like turnover in prime minister, even higher turnover in cabinet ministers, and issues like that. And I think, it is the choices that politicians make and the culture which obviously they shape, and voting systems do to some extent shape, but those are the primary factors that determine political stability, I would say.
And I guess there's also a question about whether stability is a good or a bad thing, or to what
Hmm.
extent it is a good thing and to what extent it's a bad thing, because it's probably not a simple binary, all one and none of the other. And that we've both been talking essentially as if instability is a bad thing. But if you were to take an extreme world of almost zero political instability, well, in fact, in a way, we see this with the US election, congressional level, that almost no seats in the Senate or the House of Representatives change hands. The vast majority of seats, it's a dead cert as to which party is going to win. And in as much as there is a political contest, it's the primary contest to be your party's candidate. And indeed, one could argue that that has some quite damaging effects on American politics, because it means the contest to win your party's primary, and that pulls you towards focusing on your own party's most vocal sort of supporters, as opposed to the focus being on winning the swing voters in the public election. And so there are definitely circumstances in which a lack of stability can feel very undesirable or even undemocratic, because if you just have the same people always in power, almost regardless of the election result, that's the other way, in a way of looking at Italian politics. It's not just that it was very unstable, has been very unstable, but also just the same people are always in power. It feels like, what does the election really do? So are we maybe being a bit wrong in just sort of treating instability as a bad thing, and maybe we should rebrand it volatility, or rebrand it churn, and say that churn is actually, there's a degree of churn which is essential for democracy to feel like it's functioning and being responsive.
Yeah, well, I do think there are certainly downsides to overstability in certain things. I think there are certainly coalitions or parties that have remained in power for too long and have become stale in terms of responding to policy things. You get that sort of gerontocracy where people have been in power for so long that they, you know, aren't allowing, new ideas, new, styles of doing things to come through. And also, obviously, there is that very negative effect of long stints in power does correlate in to some extent with political corruption, because people get very used to the system working in their favor. And I would be very obviously, you don't want ministers churning over all the time, but you do want, what is possibly a regular alternation in power.
Mm.
It's just sort of obviously there will be different perspectives on how frequent that is. And that's why I would always say that probably the best system in that regard is the Scandinavian systems, where you have the two blocks that alternate semi-regularly, where you have, obviously a degree of policy stability in there, but also a degree of policy change, because you have a true alternation of government while having a very powerful parliaments that have an influence on long-term influence on policy. And I think obviously, there are places where stability is a good thing, such as in terms of, certain areas of policy, but also you do not want, stalety where things are never changing. And I think that's why a lot of people would look at the Swiss political system, where you have this permanent grand coalition of the four largest parties, as quite an oddity. Although, of course, that is slightly tempered by the Swiss government being relatively weak in terms of its powers. But I think in Britain, where you obviously have a very strong government, parties being in power for too long definitely does have some negatives to it.
So finally, just before we wrap up, thinking about all of the things you found with your research, for those who are interested in campaigning for electoral reform, such as getting a version of PR for, say, the House of Commons in Westminster, what would you sort of draw from your research as the top tip or the top bear trap to bear in mind when trying to make the case for electoral reform?
Well, I think that there are a few things in terms of there's both the messaging angle and also the historical precedent angle. And I think in terms of historical precedent, it's necessary to understand that where proportional representation was adopted in Europe in the early 20th century and also in New Zealand in 1996, is it came after the multi-party system developed. It did not create the multi-party system that it's often said to in literature, but it followed that and was a response to that and the non-proportional systems breaking down and no longer being able to deal with a multi-party system. And I think it is important that as Britain seemingly transitions towards a more multi-party system, that that is creating the sort of, what's the word? Creating the conditions for proportional representation rather than trying to force proportional representation necessarily when it isn't going to come up naturally.
And that sort of fits, I guess, with British political history, that we probably came closest to electoral reform for the House of Commons in the 20s, where it was the multi-party system came first, and then the particular interest in electoral reform sort of followed from that. And it's what we've seen, with the rise of Liberals, then the Liberal SDP alliance, and more recently perhaps with Reform and Lib Dems. Or it's the change in the party system that pushes then interest in change in the electoral system.
Well, yes, and I would say that the problem with trying to force the hand and sort of bringing it up or unorganically is that you're not going to attract popular or necessary elite interest in terms of the people who are actually in charge. It's all well opposition parties being in favor of proportional representation, but if the government feels that there's voting system is working in their favor enough without any severe public drawbacks, then there's no real incentive for them to change. And I think that's what you look at a lot of the European electoral reforms. It was about making sure that the people who were in favor of proportional representation were aware when things got to that breaking point where the non-proportional systems were no longer able to cope with the political system as it existed. And it sort of was more of a pragmatic shift in a way, because even parties that traditionally benefited from the non-proportional system could no longer argue that it was working.
And I guess that suggests that the route to electoral reform requires a twin track approach of you need people campaigning for parties outside the existing main parties to break the current electoral system. And you need the case being made as to why then electoral reform is the solution to the broken political system. But you sort of need to to be a successful electoral reformer, it almost sounds like you should both join a political party and deliver leaflets for it, and join a lobby group like Make Votes Matter or Electoral Reform Society, or whatever. That you need both, that breaking the existing system as well as showing that there's a fix then for it. Both are required.
Well, I would never be so.
You obviously would quite rightly be a little bit more politically neutral, I'm sure, in the picture you draw.
Yes, I would never quite say that everyone needs to become a Lib Dem leafleter to deliver proportional
Yeah.
representation, but I do think, you know, it's always sort of been for electoral reformists. If you look at Belgium, which was obviously the very first country to make this shift, it was a very much a more of a medium term strategy. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's about the twin tracks of waiting for political developments to benefit the argument, while also making sure that you are permanently campaigning, trying to bring people on side, notice the benefits. And also, I think what is really important is to be skeptical of the received wisdoms around different voting systems, particularly on stability, and point out where non-proportional systems are breaking their received wisdom, as they do quite a lot. I think that is very much the thing, is that it's not so much that proportional representation doesn't stack up with non-proportional supporters' view of it. It's that non-proportional voting systems themselves do not actually stand up to the defenses that are put in favor of them. And I think constantly highlighting those contradictions, as well as very many successes of political successes where in countries that use proportional voting systems, that is very important. And I think it is always about stressing but I would always be very cautious of going too much on case studies, because then you will have people flip the Italy card at you. But it is about, if you're going to go down the examples route, you do have to be wary of that variation and stress that, be very careful about pointing out that what we do know for sure about proportional representation is that it delivers more proportional election results. Everything else, to varying degrees, there's a bit more variation in terms of how it's played out where PR is used. So I think if you want to go down example routes, it's always about striking that balance. But I would always say that probably the best example for British campaigners is New Zealand, because they pretty much hit it out the park.
That seems an excellent note of praise to New Zealand on which to wrap it up. So thank you hugely for that, Dylan. That's been really fascinating. I will include in the show notes for people some various follow-up links, including to the booklet that you wrote, you produced for Make Votes Matter, which is available for free online. People can also find Dylan and his fantastic electoral graphics on Blue Sky at dylandifford.bsky.social, and myself at markpackuk.bsky.social. And if you like listening, please do tell others about this podcast and give it a rating or review in your favorite podcast app to help feed those algorithm gods. So thank you greatly for your time today, Dylan, and thank you everyone for listening.